Good evening, and welcome to Seder of the Seder, understanding how the Haggadah helps us to re-experience Yetziat Mitzrayim, led by Rabbi Reuven Taragin. Rabbi Taragin is Dean of Overseas Students at Yeshivat HaKotel, an Educational Director of World Mizrahi, and also Musbach of the Israeli Chief Rabbinate. We will be muting everyone during the talk, but if people would like to come off mute and ask a question, they're welcome to. And alternatively, we can pick up Q&A at the end, according to whatever seems to work best. Rabbi Taragin is putting the links to the sources in the chat box. With that, I give you Rabbi Taragin.
Okay, thank you very much, Gary. I don't know if it's Mr. or Doctor or Rabbi, but Gary, thank you. And thank you very much.
Gary does the job well.
Gary, okay. And thank you very much to Louise for the coordination. And of course, to Rabbi Zobin, the Mara Da'atra. So I just shared here two links to two different documents that I'll share screen on, but in case people want to have it for themselves to use. So I shared these links, and it's a real pleasure to share Torah with the Ner Yisrael community. The only thing I regret is the fact that we're not doing it in person, and I have wonderful memories of being with you year in, year out, in the main shul, in the 8:30 minyan. I look forward to that happening again soon, and that this shouldn't replace that, but may it be for the time being in place of it until we're able to be together again in person. The topic we're speaking about tonight is a really critical one for the Seder night, both for understanding the theory and principles of the Seder night, and also for understanding the actual Haggadah, no less. Most of us are familiar with hundreds of different local minutia type divrei Torah on the Haggadah, things that are the trees of the Haggadah instead of the forest. And today we're going to be able to see the broader forest of the Haggadah, if you use that colloquium in the UK of the forest versus the trees. We're going to see the forest of the Haggadah and really how it's expressive of the principles that the Haggadah is rooted in. Without further ado, I'm going to share screen with the first document, and again, we'll be using two. There are two basic methodological questions that I feel need to be asked about the mitzvah of commemorating Yetziat Mitzrayim on the Seder night. The first is how it relates to the similar mitzvah we have the rest of the year. And the second is how it relates to the other mitzvot it coincides with. And to a certain extent, these two questions are flip sides of one another and really representative of the tension that exists regarding the mitzvah on the Seder night. To what extent is it similar to what's done the rest of the year? And to what extent is it unique in that it coincides with other mitzvot going on the Seder night? And just to formulate the question, we know the Mishnah in Brachot Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet that we quote on the Seder night talks about the mitzvah of Maskir and Yetziat Mitzrayim Balelot, days and nights, of course. The Rambam mentions this mitzvah in Hilchot Kriyat Shema, mitzvah lahazkir Yetziat Mitzrayim b'yom u'valayla. The commentaries like the Pri Megadim on the Shulchan Aruch ask, why do we need a special mitzvah on the Seder night? Every night we're mechuyev to commemorate it. The Minchat Chinuch, famous commentary on the Sefer Chinuch, even uses Seder terminology when he asks, right? Manishtana, how is this night greater, better than all the nights of the year when we have a mitzvah to recount the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim? So this really is the opening question. And what we're going to do tonight is, when relating to the principles, we're going to identify the many differences, but ultimately try and get to the difference with a capital T, the most important basic difference between the mitzvah, the rest of the year, and the Seder night. If we look at page 2, continuing on the Makorot, we're going to begin from the Mishnah, of course, which describes how we fulfill the mitzvah, and see the Rambam and how he codifies it, and ultimately take a look at the Haggadah itself and see how we fulfill it. I don't know how many of you learned Daf Yomi, but it really is amazing that right now we're learning Arvei Psachim in the 2 weeks before the Seder night. And so Amir Tashem will get up to this Mishnah here. For those who don't know, Masechet Psachim is arranged in chronological order. starting with the night before Pesach, going up to the night of Pesach. There are a number of Masechtot that are organized by the timeline of the Chag. For example, Yoma, starting with the 7 days the Kohen Gadol separated before, etc. In any case, the second Mishnah of the Perek gets up to the second coast. The first Mishnah, of course, deals with the first coast, Kiddush. And it says, V'kan haben shoel aviv. Here, once we pour the second cup, the son asks the questions of the father. These are two things that are already unique. Yes. Number one, the fact that we involve the father and son, parents and children. And number two, the fact that we want there to be question and answer. And the reason I mention this as two factors is because they really are two and they're separable. Meaning, if there are no children, we still ask questions. And if the children don't ask questions, we still engage them. And you see this further down on the page in the Rambam's codification, Halacha Bet, Mitzvah L'Hodia Labanim, Halacha Gimel, V'tzarach Lasos Shinui B'layla Zeh Kadei Sheyiru Habanim V'yishalu. There really are two distinct points. Going back for a second, just to mention a little bit in the context, of course, we know from the Psukim in the Torah, Shmot Perek Yud Gimel, V'hayaki Yish'alcha Bincha Machar Lemor, the way the Torah presents the telling of the story. The Sefer Mitzvos Katan talks about Lahagid Livno, Belel Tedvav B'Nisan Yetziat Mitzrayim. So these are two issues that relate to the format of how we relay the content on the Seder night, the involving of the child and the asking of questions. And I think the explanation for these two things is very simple and very basic. The Seder night is different than the commemoration of the rest of the year because we want to pass it on to future generations. It's not just a personal, private commemoration. And to do this, we need to engage them, and we want to create question and answers so that there'll be interest, there'll be excitement, there'll be a hole they're trying to fill with the information we're giving. But what we want to focus on for the rest of the shir tonight is the content, not just the format. And the first thing I want to point out in the Mishnah that we already started looking at is the fact that the Mishnah mixes in an interesting way the subjective with the objective. The Mishnah begins, V'yemein dat beven aviv melamdo, right? If the child doesn't know how to ask questions, the father teaches him the manishtana. After the manishtana, the Mishnah writes in a very similar way, Ulefi da'ato shel ben aviv melamdo, which makes it sound very subjective, right? It's based on who the child is and how the child thinks. But then the Mishnah continues with the objective and mentions three components. The first is Matra Beginut Mesai Mishavach. We begin with the negative and end with the positive. The second is Vidoresh Me'arami Obed Avi Ad She'igmar Kol HaParsha Kula. And the third is Rabbi Gamliel Hayomer Kol Shel Amar Shlosha Dvar Melu B'Pesach Lo Yatsa Yedei Chovato. And the truth is, Rabbi Gamliel's statement is the most surprising because we've already done things to commemorate Yetziat Mitzrayim. Why are those things so lacking that you're not Yotzei without what Rabbi Gamliel adds? And if we really are so lacking, why do we even do them? So what's the relationship between these three components? And the bigger picture question here is the relationship between the three components and the initial subjective sounding phrase of Lefi dato shel ben aviv melamdo. So which one is it? Right, kind of like the tension in education. Schools that will say, it's whatever you want, but you have to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? So is it subjective or objective? Now, one more question before we look at the things a little bit more in depth, and just to continue with our Rambam for a minute, we saw halacha bet, mitzvah lo dia labanim, halacha gimel, the need to ask questions, halacha dalid. The Rambam gets to the content, v'tzarach lahatra begnutzu l'sayim b'shevach. In the end of the halacha, the Rambam mentions Arami Oved Avi. Halacha hey, he mentions Rabbi Gamliel, kol mi shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu v'chamisha lo yatsa yedei chovato. But the next point I want to make that's very interesting is that if you look at page 3 on the Makorot sheet here, the Rambam and the Ramban and the Chinuch, Sefer HaChinuch, all mention as part of the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the saying of thank you, the Hodah, Lashon HaRambam, the Ramban, Halel v'Hodah, the Chinuch, Lahalel v'Lishabeach. And the question is, why is this a basic part on the Seder night as opposed to the rest of the year? Just in passing, I'll mention there are a lot of halachic implications of this. For example, we call the matzah lechem oni. One of the explanations given by the Gemara is that it's lechem she'onin alav dvarim harbe. We speak about it a lot. That's why the matzah is revealed when we do magid, right? You're supposed to be speaking about the matzah. It says here, dvarim harbe, Rashi explains that the many things we say isn't just quantitative, but qualitative, that we say on it Hallel and the Haggadah. The Hallel is also supposed to be said on the matzah. And that's why the Rishonim, like the Ran, say that we're supposed to finish Hallel before Chatzot. just like we aim to finish the matzah before Chatzot. Interestingly enough, just to add to this, the Avudraham, one of the Spanish Rishonim, explains that the word Haggadah, V'yigadat levincha, of course, in the Torah, the word Haggadah really comes from the phrase Hodah v'Shevach. So the whole Haggadah itself doesn't just include Shevach, but it's its essence. The Avudraham uses this idea to explain the famous paragraph in the Haggadah where we say, "Afilu kulanu chacham, kulanu nevonim, kulanu yodim et Torah." We still, even if we all know it, we have to learn it anyway on the Seder night. Why? He says because the goal of the Haggadah is not just to tell and know the story; it's to celebrate it. It's to give thanks. That's a basic part. And obviously, the question is, why? How? How did the Rishonim know that Hallel and Hodah is a basic part of Sipur? And I think the answer is, if you understand how the Sipur and the Seder night is different than the way we tell the story the rest of the year, you understand right away why Hallel and Hodah are basic to it. And in order for us to answer these questions and get a better understanding of things, we're going to take a look at what these different stages of Magid actually mean. And first, we'll take a look at what the Gemara says, and again, the continuation of the study of principles. And we're going to shift in a few minutes to the Haggadah itself and see how we actually fulfill these things. And that's really important because that to me is the most important part of the shiur, not just the theory, but the lab section. I don't know how it works in England, but when I studied science in university, we had lecture and lab. So the lecture is important, but the lab is critical. Purim also, you have lecture and lab, but we won't talk about that here. In any case, the Gemara in Psachim Daf Kuf Tet Zayin Amud Aleph relates to the first part of the Mishnah. Matra begnut Mesayim b'shevach, and it asks, "My begnut, what is the negative that we're meant to begin with?" There are famously two opinions here. Rav says, "Mitchila ovdei avodat gilulim," the part that recounts how we were initially idol worshippers, and Shmuel says, "Avodah me'inu." In case we're not familiar with the pieces they're referring to, Devarim Perek Vav, Avodah me'inu lefaro b'Mitzrayim v'yotzienu Hashem b'Mitzrayim v'yad chazakah, etc. The piece that Rav is referring to that talks about how we were initially idol worshippers appears in Yoshua Perek Chav Daled. Talks about how Terach, we came from Terach, they were idol worshippers, the whole story and flow of Avraham. Now let's take a closer look at this disagreement for a moment. Let's begin by asking ourselves, which one of these opinions would be the more natural, simple one? If you were asked which piece would be the more appropriate one to use to recount the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, I think most of us would agree with Shmuel. Avodah me'inu is in the Torah. It relates directly to the story of the Seder night. Avodah me'inu lefaro b'Mitzrayim vayotzienu Hashem Elokeinu misham. Why does Rav disagree? So the Avudraham, we already mentioned, says something very basic and very important. He says, Genut can refer to physical slavery, but a deeper level of Genut, of negative, is spiritual slavery. In fact, I think we can take it even further and say, Rav wants us to appreciate more of the story, more in depth, more historical perspective, understand why we had to go down to Egypt in the first place, because we were idol worshippers and we had to lose that. Mitchila ovdei avodat gilulim hayu avotenu gives us a deeper, broader understanding of the story. And you see this beautifully in the golden language of the Rambam that we referenced briefly before, and I want to take another look at now. The Rambam mentions both these options, but look at the verb he uses to describe each of them. He mentions Rav's opinion first, matchil u'misaper shebetchila hayu avotenu b'mei terach, etc. Later in the same halach, the Rambam writes, "V'chein matchil u'modia she'avodah me'inu lefaro b'Mitzrayim." Modia means to make known. Misaper means to tell the whole story. Avodah me'inu is the simplest, most basic level. Mitchila avdei avodah zarah tells us more. So really, it's about minimalism versus maximalism. And the question is, what do we do? Anyone knows what we do? Which one do we do? Do we do avodah me'inu, like Shmuel said, or mitchila avdei avodah zarah, like Rav said? Right. So as Lindsay said, we're Jewish, so we do both. And I want to show you how we do both, because this is the very beginning of our appreciation of the Haggadah. And before we talk about the flow of the Haggadah, I want to relate to a question that's natural to ask. The Haggadah, as we know, comes from many different lands across the diaspora, from a period of hundreds of years. So the question is, should we even be looking for structure in the Haggadah? And I think if you look carefully at the Haggadah, you see there's a real flow of how it was put together. And I think an excellent way to see this is by just starting and looking at the introduction and the conclusion. We begin the Haggadah with Halach Ma'anya, a piece from Bavel, Aramaic. We end the Haggadah with a piece that says it's the end, right? Chasal, Seder, Pesach, Kehilchato. That's a piece in regular Hebrew. It seems to have come from Italy. And the question is, why do we, how does the beginning and the end relate to each other? And what's interesting is that the beginning and the end share the fact that in both these places, and only these two places, we speak about our dreams for the future. In the beginning of the Haggadah, we say, Hashata Hacha, L'shana Haba, Ba'ara di Yisrael. And of course, everyone remembers the end of the Haggadah, L'shana Haba b'Yerushalayim. And obviously, there's a difference between the two, but there's a similarity between the two. And you see that someone was thinking about how the Haggadah would begin and the Haggadah would end. Right after the introduction of Halach Ma'anya, we get right to it with the 4 questions. And what you see here is that we have 2 parallel frameworks that are built around the Gnut and the Shevach. The first one begins with the 4 questions of Manishtana, continues with the Gnut of Avadim Hayinu, and the parts connected to it. And we get to the story of the 5 rabbis. And after the Gnut, we get to the Shevach, Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu. After this first round, we have a second very similar round that begins with 4 questions of the 4 sons. Then it has Rav's Gnut, Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarayah Vatein V'Achshav Karvano HaMakom La'avodato. And then we have the second Shevach, Baruch Shomer Avtachato Yisrael Baruch Hu. So it's interesting that we do both. And I think we'll begin to understand this by emphasizing, by highlighting how the 2 frameworks are different and not only similar. And I'll explain what I mean. The first framework is as simple as you can get. The 4 questions are really one question. Why is tonight different? There's no depth there. The first Gnut is, of course, the simple Gnut of Shmuel. And the Shevach that we have in the first round is the Haggadah's version of Rabbi Dub Dub, thank you for Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? Meaning, Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu. There's nothing beyond that. The second round is where we're looking at things with more nuance. The 4 questions are asked by 4 different children from 4 different perspectives. The Gnut is the deeper level, as we've already spoken about, the spiritual level, the earlier part of the story. And that's why the Shevach, because we're talking about a broader historical flow, the Shevach can include the Shomer, the Shmirat HaHaftacha, that really started much earlier and then continued. So I think the answer to the question we asked earlier about, is it based on the level of the child or is it objective? And of course, the answer here again is both. And if you look carefully at the Haggadah and you're in tune with the forest of the Haggadah, you realize what the answer to maybe the most basic challenge of the Seder night is. Everybody knows that at a Seder night, we have people from age 3 to age 93. We have people who are learned and we have people who have no background. And the challenge everyone faces is, how do you run a Seder for all these people? And what usually happens is that we either go to one extreme or the other. It's lowbrow or highbrow, or we veer back and forth by chance, haphazardly. And I think everyone suffers from that kind of Seder. The way the Haggadah is built is from the basic to the complex. The first round is for everyone. Manishtana, Avadim Hayinu, Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu. Anyone who can understand anything can understand this. And this is not the right time for fancy schmancy divrei Torah given by yeshiva boys about the gematria of the 4th word of Manishtana versus the gematria of the 2nd word of Kiddush, and why, and if you turn the word upside down, it looks like, stockings, meaning it's the basic message. The second round is where we're getting more in depth. I don't know if a first grader can understand the gnut of spiritual enslavement. I don't know. Or the concept of Shmirat HaHaftacha. This is the storyline, and we approach it on 2 levels. Level 1, and then a parallel framework for level 2. Let's now continue to the next part of the Haggadah. Right after Baruch Shomer Avtachato, we have the famous piece of V'hisha Amda. And here I'm going to ask a question to get some crowd involvement, but I want to I want to make the question clear. Okay, what I'm asking, and more importantly, what I'm not asking. V'hisha Amda, what is its goal? I'm not asking what it says. I'm not asking for a translation. I'm not asking for a summary. I'm asking, what does the piece hope to accomplish? What is the goal of the piece, V'hisha Amda? Anyone?
Our personal involvement in what's going on.
Was that David?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I think that's correct, but I want to sharpen it even further, if I may. You said we want our personal involvement, and I'm sure you'll agree with me when I say we want to create relevance. We want to connect the story to us. Now, just to backtrack for a moment, the first place in the Haggadah we attempt this is the first time we mention the storyline. Right after Avad Demayinu, we say, "Ve'ilu lo hotzi hakadosh baruch hu et avotenu mi Mitzrayim, harei anu vanenu vnei vanenu meshu b'demayinu lefarav Mitzrayim." The way we try and create relevance the first time is by saying, had it not been for Yetziat Mitzrayim, we would still be there. Now, being English people who are always brutally honest, right? And again, maybe sometimes we're nice and we don't, but when you're asked to be brutally honest, we are always brutally honest. How successful is that first attempt to create relevance? What would you say? First of all, I don't know if it's historically accurate. 3,500 years later, we'd still be slaves. Number two, I'll tell you an interesting way I can make point number two. A number of years ago, somebody sent me a picture from Time magazine of African-American youth in the United States spray painting a statue of Abraham Lincoln. And the reason that was so interesting is because, of course, Abraham Lincoln was central in the emancipation of the African Americans. So how could a young African American boy be spray painting Abraham Lincoln's statue 150 years later? And the answer is, even if you could prove to this boy that he would still be a slave had it not been for Abraham Lincoln, you don't feel it. You don't feel this appreciation, which is the challenge on the Seder night. V'hishamda is the second attempt. Once we see the story in a broader framework of Baruch Shomer Avtachato Yisrael, it's not just about slavery to emancipation, which happened only once, but it's about God keeping his word to us, his Avtacha to keep us alive. So now that we see it that way, Vihi, Pashup Pshat is the Haftacha, by the way, Vihi Sha'amda La'avotenu Velanu, Shelo Echad Bilvad Amar Aleinu L'Chalotenu, Ela Shebechol Dor V'Dor Midmenu L'Chalotenu. Now, we're not done yet. It's going to become much more relevant, but we already can see here the relevance that we're establishing. So any questions about this first part of the three-pronged Magid, Matra B'Not V'Sayim V'Shevach, and the two frameworks through which we fulfill it? Okay, so now we're up to Arami Ovid Avi. And the question is, what does Arami Ovid Avi add to the mix? How is it different than what came before it? Anyone? So if you look back at the Mishnah, that we began with, it uses a very interesting word to introduce Arami Ovid Avi, right? Matcha begnut Messiah Mishevach v'doresh me Arami Ovid Avi ad sheyigmar kol haparsha kula. To be doresh means to go in depth. And that's the first two words of Arami Ovid Avi. Anyone remembers what they are? What are the first two words of Arami Ovid Avi? Anyone? Say ulamad, which is the Eretz Yisrael version of the Babylonian Tashma. The Babylonians say, come here. Eretz Yisrael people say ulamad, two different educational approaches. But in any case, v'doresh me Arami Ovid Avi. This is where we're meant to go into the nitty gritty. This is the place for those in-depth Divrei Torah. And you see this from the beautiful language of the Rambam. The Rambam, I'll see it a little bit later on the page here. The Rambam, when he codifies the halacha of Arami Ovid Avi, get back to where we were, right here. So here's the Rambam, right? And then he says, "V'hu sheyidrosh me'Arami Ovid Avi ad sheyigmar kol haparsha kula, v'chol hamosif umarich bidrash parsha zu harei ze meshubach." The Rambam tells you, everyone knows that line in the Haggadah, right? The Rambam says not manishtano, not Avad Demayinu, Arami Ovid Avi. And that's the irony. The irony is that people are so worn out from the gematria Divrei Torah and Avad Demayinu that after V'hi Shamda, at least in the Starim I've experienced, people say, okay, I'll meet you by the Makos, right? And people just roll through Arami Ovid Avi, which is the time of the Seder for the intricate Divrei Torah. And again, I don't know that every kid or every person without background is going to appreciate that as much as they may have appreciated the first part. And just to take a closer look at the actual Haggadah and see it together inside, and just, just from a bird's eye view. We're not going to go into each thing, but just to get a sense of how it works for those who are not familiar, right? You have Tzei Ulamat, page 2. Ma bikesh lavan harami lasot leYaakov Avinu, parallel Gaza, etc. And here, what I've done is I've bolded each of the psukim from the parsha of Harami Ovid Avi, which is, of course, Devarim Perek Chavav. When a person brings Bikurim, they tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And you see how we take each of the phrases of the pasuk, those are underlined, and we darshan it. We tell you it a little bit more in depth. Okay, and we take each pasuk and each phrase, and this is the longest part of the Haggadah, 2 pages. And it concludes with a shevach that's really built for it. Right, the first shevach is Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu, and the shevach here is Kama Ma'alot Tovot LaMakom Aleinu. Or after Dani we say, Alachad Kama V'Chama Tova Kfulo Mechupelet LaMakom Aleinu. And obviously, again, Dayenu is a song built to emphasize just how much there is to thank for. And this is something we get a better appreciation for once we've learned through the segment of Harami Ovid Avi. But here you have to be careful not to cheat. Everyone knows what I mean, right? Because at every Seder, we begin properly. Ilu ilu hotzianu mi Mitzrayim velo asavahem shefatim dayenu 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 dayenu. And once you've done that once, there are a lot of starim where they lose patience. And the next one is ilu asavahem shefatim velo asav Eloheim dayenu ilu asav Eloheim. Wait a second. The whole point of Dayenu is that we should be maximizing our appreciation of each of these lines, right? My wife is looking at me and saying, but you always skip ahead. Okay. But in any case, that's what this part of the Seder is about. Now that brings us to the third part of Maggid. And the third part of Maggid, of course, as we saw before, is Rabban Gamliel. And again, he makes a bold statement, which we find even stranger now that we've appreciated what each part of Maggid gives us. How could Rabban Gamliel come along and say anyone who doesn't say these 3 things is not Yotzei? Now, by the way, these 3 objects, of course, are the 3 central mitzvot of the Seder night. And if you look at the original language of the Manishtana, there was one question about matzah, one question about moror, and one question about the meat that we're eating being roasted by Mishnah and Psachim in the 10th parak. But why? Why is this so important? And I think the answer is very simple, very important, and connects to the part of the Mishnah that comes right after Rabban Gamliel in the Mishnah, in the Rambam, and in the Haggadah. So if you look here in the Mishnah, right after Rabban Gamliel, we get to the piece of V'chol dor v'dor chayav adam l'rotet atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. In the Rambam, when he codifies the halacha, matcha b'gnut, Harami Ovid Avi, shloshet dvar melu, V'chol dor v'dor chayav adam l'rotet atzmo. And again, we find the same thing, of course, in the Haggadah. I'm sure we all remember it, but I'll share the Haggadah with us again anyway, so we can take a look at it. Okay, you have Rabban Gamliel, Pesach Matzah Umarar, B'chol Dor V'Dor. And I'd like to give a little bit of an explanation of why these 2 things are juxtaposed and why Rabban Gamliel's 3 things are so important for reaching this higher level. The goal of the Seder night is different than the goal the rest of the year because it's not just about remembering something that happened in the past. On the Seder night, we're meant to re-experience personally what's happening in the present so that the rest of the year we can remember what happened to us. We're all thinking about Rabbi Jonathan Sachs this year. One of the beautiful ideas he speaks about is about how history is his story. It's about something that happened to someone else. The Seder night is my story, something that I myself experience. And the question is, how do we get from studying ancient history to experiencing something in the present? Well, the first thing, obviously, is the storyline and the details. You can't feel like you're experiencing something you don't know in detail how it happened. But how do we get to a reenactment? And the answer is relics. Now, the relics generally used in reenactments are totally insignificant. But on the Seder night, they are the objects that our ancestors ate in order to merit being redeemed, and objects that symbolize what the story is all about. And once we've studied things properly, we can then connect the story to the objects, and through this, transcend time and experience things ourselves. This is the ultimate end goal of how it's different. And if we remember our initial 2 questions, the second answers the first. How is the telling of the story on the Seder night different than the rest of the year? In that it coincides, not coincidentally, but incidentally, with relics on the night when the experience occurred so that we can re-experience it. And that's why Rabbi Gamliel says, Kol shalom shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach lo yatsa yedei chovato b'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo. That's the chiyuv. And that's why you're not yotzei the chiyuv unless you connect the story to the objects that allow us to re-experience it. And in fact, in our Haggadah, we add a line that does not appear in the Mishnah that emphasizes this point. Lo et avotenu bilvad ga'al hakadosh baruch hu, ela af otanu ga'al imahem. And this is really an answer to the first attempt to create relevance in Avodah Me'inu. Avodah Me'inu said, if Hashem had not redeemed our ancestors, we would still be slaves. This piece responds and says, it wasn't only our ancestors. In fact, I'll show you on the source document, the chart that I made that contrasts the different attempts to create relevance. We're just going back. One of the Zoom skills we need to teach people going into education now in the 21st century is shifting back and forth within share screens. But in any case, if we go back down to the Rabbi Gamliel Behold Over There section. So we had the first attempt at relevance, Avadim Mitzrayim, Ve'ilu lo hotzi hakadosh baruch hu avoteinu miMitzrayim, and then V'hishamda B'chol dor v'dor, something similar happens. Now we're saying B'chol dor v'dor, we experience the same thing, and it's not Ve'ilu lo hotzi hakadosh baruch hu et avoteinu miMitzrayim. It's lo et avotenu bilvad ga'al hakadosh baruch hu, ela af otanu ga'al imahem. This is how Hallel is so special, important, basic to the mitzvah on the Seder night. The Ran quotes Rav Haigon, right, one of the Gonim, who explains why we don't say the bracha on Hallel on the Seder night. And he says it's not like the regular recital of Hallel, which is commemorative. It's shira. It's celebrative of what we are experiencing ourselves. And interestingly, when he quotes the Mishnah, he quotes Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel is the source for why this is experiential. And it's not just Rav Haigon, it's also the Rimagash, one of the very early Spanish Rishonim, who makes the same point. And just to appreciate it in the context of of the Haggadah, we'll share a screen with the Haggadah again. There's a word that connects between the telling of the story and the recitation of Hallel. Lefichach. Lefichach. Lefichach anachnu chayavim. Neil said, "Kol shalom shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach lo yatsi yedei chovato. B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo. Lefichach anachnu chayavim lahodot l'Hallel shaveh." And I believe a person should not continue with the Seder if they're not feeling like they're experiencing it, because that's why the Chiyuv Hallel is there. By the way, many have the custom to say Hallel in Shul. Same Seder night. We're saying it twice. We say it Pesach morning, Pesach night, and at the Seder. And the basic explanation is that Pesach morning, we're saying it for the Yom Tov of Pesach. Pesach night, we're saying it for the Yom Tov of the night of Pesach. So that kind of narrows down the fact that the Seder is not the Yom Tov. It's about the experience. And when we say B'tzeis Yisrael miMitzrayim before the meal, we're supposed to feel like we're leaving. And the bracha of Geula expresses this very powerfully. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam asher ga'alanu, which one could have interpreted to mean the royal we, but then we add Vigol as Avotenu. So once you add Vigol et Avotenu, you know that Asher Ga'alanu means us. Us. We talk about our future Geula as well. So this kind of, gives us the bigger picture perspective of what we're doing with Magid and the first part of Hallel and how the latter flows from the former. I don't know how much time we're supposed to have, and one of the big isurim of going too long, but if we have a few more minutes, I would say 3 to 5 more minutes, I'll continue by telling you just Hallel after the meal. Gary, we have 3 to 5 more minutes?
You're welcome to go well beyond that.
Oh, well beyond. Never say that. Never say that to a rabbi. Okay. In any case, the Abarbanel explains that the Hallel after the meal is where we start focusing on the eventual Geula as well. We start looking forward based on the experience we're having in the present. And the truth is, the bracha of Geula, we already saw this. If you remember, Rabbi Gamliel, the great optimist, teaches us that the bracha of Geula, we don't just speak about the Geula we're experiencing. We talk about the Geula of the future as well. I'll share the Haggadah again. We say, Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher galanu v'galat avotenu miMitzrayim. And Rabbi Akiva says, Kain Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei avotenu yagienu l'modim v'leregalim machem abarim l'kratenu l'shalom v'nodeh lecha shir chadash hagulatenu v'alpatut nafshenu. That's just in brief in that bracha. But after the meal, and again, you have to be careful not to eat too much, drink too much, so a person can continue after the meal properly. But after the meal, we start talking about the eventual geula. And I want to share a beautiful piece from the Smak, one of the Balei HaTosfos, who codified the mitzvot. The first mitzvah everyone knows is Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hotzeiticha Me'eretz Mitzrayim. And everyone asks, what kind of mitzvah is that? It's a statement. So many say it's a mitzvah for us to come to believe in it. And some say it's the background to the mitzvah. The Smak says the mitzvah is to use the experience of Yetziat Mitzrayim to believe in God as Redeemer in the future. Kishem shani rotzeh shetaminu bi shani hotzeiti etchem, kach ani rotzeh shetaminu bi shani Hashem Elokechem v'ani atid lekabetz etchem u'lashiachem. And the Orach Chaim has a beautiful way of expressing this. He points out that in a number of places in the Torah, Yetziat Mitzrayim is described as happening in the present, even though it happened in the past, didn't it? Orach Chaim says no. Geula is a process that happens again and again. And Rav Kook described it beautifully. He said, "Hagula nimshechati v'olachet." It's a continuum. Geulat Mitzrayim v'geulata atid hashlema hi pula achat she'ena poseket. It's a never stopping, constantly continuing continuum of geula. So this is one aspect of the halal after the meal. The second aspect is the fact that we speak about regular life. Notein lechem l'chol basar kili olam chasdo. What's called Halel Haggadah. And it's both of these, it's not one or the other. The Ramban has a beautiful piece where he speaks about this at the very end of Parshat Bo. The Ramban asks why we have so many mitzvot that are meant to commemorate Yetziat Mitzrayim. And he answers that God is not going to bring miracles to refute the beliefs of every heretic in every generation, which is why it's so critical to remember and pass on the memory of these great nisim. But towards the end of this piece, the Ramban speaks about what the implication of these nisim is. And he says, Umin anisim hagdolim hamefursamim, through the great, open, well-known miracles, Adam modeh benisim hanistarim, a person comes to recognize the hidden nisim, shehem yesod haTorah kula. They are the principle of the entire Torah. And then he says stridently, she'ein le'adam chelek b'Torat Moshe Rabbeinu, ad shena'amin b'chol dvareinu u'mikreinu shekulam nisim ein behem teva u'minago shel olam. It's to realize that everything is really something deeper and to see God's hand in the smaller parts of life. And that's part of the important continuation, implication of experiencing Yetziat Mitzrayim ourselves. The Chinuch Talmud of the Ramban expresses this idea as well. For those interested, we have Gemara and Chulin and Erechim that speak about how a person cuts their finger, a person takes out the wrong coin. They should realize it could be Min HaShamayim. And Albert Einstein said it this way: there are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle. The other is as though everything is a miracle. And that's Albert Einstein, so that's interesting. I'll conclude now with one last point from the Hasidic perspective. The Baal HaTanya writes, B'chol dor v'dor, u'v'chol yom v'yom, every day, chayav adam lirot atzmo ki'ilu yatsa yom miMitzrayim. Doesn't mean you're experiencing it each day, but you have to see yourself that you've left Mitzrayim. And the significance of that is to realize that we can transcend the limitations of physical reality. We all feel that we're limited and we can't accomplish and we can't strive for more, especially in this past year. Sfat Emet, generations later of Chassidut, says it this way: Ve'emet ki b'chol eit yesh mitzarim l'kol echad, l'chol ish Yisrael. All the time, every individual has mitzarim, borders, boundaries, limitations. V'kein maskirin b'chol yom Yetziat Mitzrayim, k'fi ma sheyodim v'zochrim she'Hashem yitbarach yotzianu. We remember that God took us out. When a person believes in God and has a relationship with God, they know there are no limitations. And this is the broader idea, the broader ideas we should be thinking about after the meal, after we've had a chance to reflect on experiencing Yetziat Mitzrayim. Okay, questions?
So people are welcome to unmute oneself and ask. Alternatively, put a question in a chat box. But whilst people are thinking, Rabbi Taragin, if you're comfortable for me to ask a question.
Absolutely.
You've mentioned Rav Kook saying that the Geulah is continuous and never-ending. And previously, I'd always assumed that the time of the coming of the Mashiach was like the achievement and the end of Geulah. So may I ask, in what sense we see the Geulah is continuing beyond the time of the coming of the Mashiach?
It's an excellent question. And truth be told, we don't know enough about what will be once Mashiach comes. The Rambam has a very interesting formulation about this where he says, it's the kind of thing you'll only know once it happens. I think Rav Kook's main point is about the time period between the Geulah from Mitzrayim and the ultimate Geulah. What he would say about what happens once Mashiach comes, I don't know. What I will say, a related question that one could ask is, very often there are very sad, tragic events in Jewish history that are hard to see as part of a Geulah, right? The Holocaust, other events, so what does it mean there's a Geulah continuum? And I think what we see from here is that a continuum in a process of Geulah doesn't mean only moving up. It doesn't mean only moving up. The same way anyone who has survived investing in any market knows that even though the markets in the course of time always go up, and there's a continuum of their going up, that continuum includes downs as well. And the downs are sometimes important preparations for the ups. But that's the point I think Rav Kook is making.
Very much. Does anybody have any further questions? So after that moment of silence, Rabbi Taragin, I'd like to thank you very much for an insightful and clear explanation, really of an aspect of the Haggadah which I personally hadn't appreciated, and I'm sure there was a lot that was new for everyone. So thank you very much. Kol hakavod and shkach.
Thank you very much again for facilitating, and I wish everyone a Chag Kasher v'Sameach.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Rabbi Taragin.
Thank you very much.
Martin, nice to see you.
Good to
Rita,
see you.
nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Hope everybody is well. Rabbi Ben and
Thank you.
family.
Thank God, all
Thank
well.
God.
Thank you.
know these people.
Polly, nice to see you. I hope Joseph is well.
He is, thank God. Yeah, very well. New baby, very well.
Ah, Mazel Tov. And Lindsay, nice to see you. I saw Binny last week when I gave them a shear. He seems well.
I just said if he could pop in, but I'm not sure he's home actually. Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
No, I was just thinking just about in this term of the kind of experiential part of the evening. I just, in general, the Sephardim do a very much more kind of active participation Seder. I'm not saying the Sephardim, not everyone, but in general, there seems to be like a much more actively participatory part of the Seder that has become kind of entrenched in this idea of experience. Whereas I feel like you said like the Ashkenazim, well, you quoted your wife telling you, oh, you always skip that bit. Like in a sense we are, I don't know, less on
many
it
of the
in some
Sephardim
way.
do. What many of the Sephardim do may include another interesting aspect, and it may be based on the famous formulation of the Rambam. The Rambam says, "B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam not lirot et atzmo, but leharot et atzmo." Show oneself, and that showing could be a way of showing others, but also, like you're saying, showing it as a way of experiencing it in a more powerful way. And so I would say even the Ashkenazim who don't act it out, definitely share that goal. That's the Mishnah there. And I think it's the ultimate end goal that makes different on the Seder night. And it's not just a possible additional added icing.
Right.
It's basic, it's critical. And so whatever it takes, I want to give you a heter, Lindsay, if you want to dance around with the matzah. You have it. It's mutter for Ashkenazim too.
I'll quote you. Okay, thanks.
Okay, if anyone gives you any trouble,
send love,
it's mutter,
send love to Shani from me, please.
Okay, Shani, love from Lindsay. She sends back. And to Abigail. Okay, I see Avi Prager is here. Nice to see you. I see Family White. Nice to see the Whites. Well, I see Avi Prager shared the source sheets.